Welcome to Mr. Investor Real Estate Dojo. Today's topic is about how does closing look like when a buyer needs to get a loan from the bank and he's buying a seller's house and the seller has a mortgage on their house or has a lien on their house. How does that transaction work in diagrams? A simple stick figure that breaks down a complex process into stone figures. And here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so what happens is when a buyer wants to buy a house and they want to get a loan from a seller that has a lien on their house or a mortgage on their house. Okay, this is the buyer, or it could be you, the investor. What you're going to do is do some marketing. The sellers call you. You create a win-win situation. Okay, and you put the house under contract. And please notice that the seller is meeting you halfway and you're meeting the seller halfway, because you have to create a win-win situation. It's not like you're giving them something. It needs to be a win-win, and that's why you guys are meeting each other in the middle. Okay. Once you guys have a contract on this house, so let's say you're going to buy this house for $100,000. Okay. Then what's going to happen is the buyer doesn't have the money. He doesn't have $100K. So he needs to go to a Bank of America or Wells Fargo or what have you and borrow the money from a lender. And so what's going to happen is, one, that the buyer has to fill out an application and get pre-approved. Once the buyer is pre-approved, the next thing that happens is that assuming that the lender wants to go ahead and take a risk on the buyer and lend them the money, the two things are going to happen. The buyer needs to sign a note, okay, to the lender, and a note is basically a contract that says, hey, Mr. Lender, I'm going to borrow $100,000. I'm going to pay you X% interest. I'm going to pay you this much a month for 30 years. And that's all basically the note says. It's an IOU, okay? Once the buyer signs a note with the lender, then the lender is going to ask the buyer to sign what's called DOT, okay? What is DOT? Deed of trust, okay? The deed of trust is a security instrument that the buyer volunteers to pledge the house as collateral in case the buyer defaults on the note. Let me put it again. The deed of trust is a security instrument that the buyer pledges his house or the property, in this situation, as a security instrument to protect the lender in case the buyer defaults. Because if the buyer defaults, the lender is going to use the DOT to have the trustee foreclose on the house. Okay? So what happens is, after the buyer signs the note, now the lender is going to give the buyer $100K cash. Okay? Now the buyer has money. And so what this contract says is that the buyer tells the seller, I'm going to give you $100K, and the seller's going to say, hey, I'm going to give you ownership of the property or the deed. So now that the buyer has money, the buyer is going to fund the seller. So notice that the buyer is giving the seller the money. Okay? In return, the seller is going to give the buyer the deed. Okay? The deed is the title. The deed is not the same as DOT, or deed of trust. The deed is the ownership, the title of the property of the house. Okay? Deed of trust is a security instrument. Okay? It's two different things, guys, so don't mess them up. Okay? So in a nutshell, the seller is going to deed over the property to the buyer once the buyer funds the seller. Okay? Now, all this happens in escrow. Or it can happen in escrow. Not always, but it can happen in escrow, okay? And now, what happens is that once the bank gives the escrow company the money, the $100K, the seller doesn't keep all the $100K, because the seller has a mortgage on the property, because he doesn't own his house free and clear, okay? And now we're going to go and talk about how that works, okay? Before the seller bought the house, he went to a lender and got a loan, and he did the same exact dance as this buyer did. He filed an application, He signed a note, he signed a deed of trust, and then therefore the lender lent them the money. So the same exact thing happened to the seller when he bought the properties. So now what's left is that the seller has given the lender a note, and then the seller had given the lender DOT, the deed of trust, which has put a lien on the title, or a cloud on the title. Therefore, the seller cannot sell the property to the buyer because there's a lien, or there's a DOT, deed of trust, in place. So what happens in that escrow is that the escrow company will give the debt balance, the principal balance, to the lender. So in this scenario where the buyer is buying the house for $100K, maybe the seller owes $80 to the bank. So the escrow company is going to send some of this money to the lender, $80K, and the remaining $20, the escrow company is going to give it to the seller. All right? And once the escrow company funds the lender, the seller's lender now is going to release their lien. Okay? And at that time, the seller is able to deed over the property to the buyer. Okay? Now, one important thing, a couple important things I want to talk to you, explain to you about is that, okay, notice that once the money is sent to the seller, the deed of trust is revoked, in a sense, if you could say that, it expires, okay, and the note has been satisfied, or has been completed, okay, satisfied. So now the seller has no obligation to the lender. Now, if you do a credit report check on the seller, this note or this liability does not show on the seller's credit report. Time to explain subject to. The one main difference about subject to is that everything happens the same on a transaction on a subject to than a traditional sale, except that the buyer does not have to go get a loan because there's existing financing available from the seller and the seller's lender, number one. And number two is that on this sector, everything happens the same except that the note stays in place, or the loan stays in place, and the deed of trust does not get waived, it stays in place. So whenever you buy a house subject to, you're not going to get the loan, number one, and number two, that note and that deed of trust stays in place, okay? The underlying note stays in place, the existing financing stays in place. So even though that the seller transfers the deed to the investor buyer or the buyer, the seller note and deed is still in place. So there is not a line through them, okay? They're still there, the DOT. And what does that mean for the seller? The guy that owns this house? Well, when somebody pulls his credit up, when he sells the house subject to, that debt or that liability is still going to show up on his credit report, okay? And number two, if this buyer buys this house subject to, and if the buyer defaults and doesn't pay the seller's note, then two things will happen. The seller will get a hit on their credit, and then the lender has the right to foreclose on the seller's house, which is now the buyer's house. So in a nutshell, if a buyer buys a house subject to, he still has to fulfill the underlying note, okay, whatever the note is. Because if he doesn't fulfill the underlying existing note that he got from the seller, the bank or the lender will foreclose on the property, which makes the buyer lose, okay? And that's very, very important. Go out there, make it happen for yourself. Don't listen to the naysayers. This is America. If you work hard, you can just make it happen.